Today we're going to be talking about Muslims in the media, and we've split the session up into 3 sections. So in this first section I'm going to be talking about Muslims in the media. We'll be looking at who owns the media. This is focusing specifically on the Western Hemisphere, more specifically North America and the UK, but also looking at Europe as well. We'll be looking at who are journalists in Europe and North America, the facts about Muslims in the media and how they're portrayed and how they're covered. And then we'll finish the session by looking at a comparison between how Muslim and non-Muslim perpetrators of terror attacks are covered in the press in Europe and North America. We'll then take a short break, and in the second section we're going to look at how politics, the media and the rise of the far right have been working together over the last few years in creating what's called an environment of hate. And we're going to be looking specifically at how a new network of far-right online media outlets are pushing Islamophobic content into the mainstream. And we're going to look very specifically at how they do that and how that structure works. And in the third section, I'm hoping you'll all help me out by having a discussion, because I have no slides, no presentation. We'll be just having a discussion about how we as Muslims feel about the coverage and how it's impacting us in our societies, and what we think are the different solutions we can partake in to either impact whether it's media coverage or the broader issues in society that we're facing at the moment. Just before we get into the crux of the matter, I just thought I'd introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Nargees Moballeghi. I studied journalism and psychology at the City University in London, and I graduated in 2007. And from there I worked, whilst I was studying and for a short period after I finished my studies, I was working in the local newspaper arena in the UK. I specialised in print journalism and investigative journalism. Shortly after I graduated, I went to Iran, where I spent almost 4 years, about 3.5, 4 years, working for Press TV, which is Iran's English language 24-hour news station. And that was a really productive time for me. I got to see high-level Middle Eastern politics from close up. I was a news anchor doing live TV news from the studio, and I was also a reporter working in the Iranian parliament, traveling with the foreign minister of Iran, working at the presidential office, and lucky enough during that time focusing mostly on the Middle East and Africa, but seeing high-level politics, being able to meet with presidents of the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Oman, different countries in Africa, Somalia and places like that. In 2011, I came back to Europe. I came back to the UK, where I was head of news for a production company that provided news for Press TV, Spanish TV stations and London radio. So there I changed my focus from the Middle East to Europe, and I managed the editors, the cameramen, the reporters and all the other different areas that make a newsroom. I went on to hold my own production company that still focused on news, and then the last few years I've had enough of news now. I've done 10 years of news and I'm focusing more on documentaries and shows. And I focus, my expertise is in 3 areas. So one is Islamophobia and legislation on Muslims, specifically in the UK but also in Europe. Racism, specifically of the black community in the UK. And I also focus on the far right. Since 2011, I've been attending and travelling across the UK, attending far right demonstrations, which, as you can imagine, is often fun and not fun. So that's a bit about me. Let's start with the first section. And I thought we'd go in straight with a bit of a guessing game, so you can just shout out your answers. We're going to start off by asking, who are journalists? So in British journalism, let's get some guesses. How many percentage of journalists in the UK do you think are white? 100. Any other guesses? Well, I don't know if I get counted as white or not, but I might, and maybe a guess from the sister's side? 98, okay. What percentage do we think is male? 95, okay. What percentage do we think is black? Who wants to take a guess?
0.
0, okay. And what percentage do we think is Muslim? There's at least one. I'm the only one. And okay, and what about for American journalists? What percentage of American journalists do we think are minorities? I think the sisters should give a guess this time. Don't leave me hanging. What percentage? 1%, okay. We did quite well with some of our guesses. British journalism is 94% white, it's 55% male, it's 3% black, and it's 0.4% Muslim. Now, 3% of the UK population is black, so comparatively, it's not faring too badly, although, of course, we could always do with more representation. Actually, nearly 5% of the UK population is Muslim. So we have a disparity in the number of Muslim journalists, because only 0.4% of journalists are Muslims, comparative to 5% in the population. American journalism, we know it's 13% minorities, because the American Society of News Editors does keep tabs on that. But we actually don't know how many Muslims journalists there are in the United States, because there's no figures. They don't keep any statistics for religious minorities. So that's in terms of journalists, my colleagues. But who do we work for? Who owns the media? There's something called the Big Six, and it's taken a bit of a time to get to six. In the early 1980s, there were nearly 50 different companies who owned 90% of America's media. By 1992, that was less than a dozen, so less than 12. Today, there are 6 major conglomerates, or we call them the Big Six, who own 90% of the media. That includes production, cable, broadcast TV, news, sports, music, online streaming, internet service providers. The world's biggest is Comcast. It's the single largest broadcast cable provider on Earth, and it's a major internet service provider. Walt Disney, we've probably all heard of. Obviously, they have theme parks and movie studios. They own major stations like ABC. You might have heard of ABC News. ESPN, which is sports, and then of course the big entertainment giants, Pixar, Marvel, and Lucasfilms. 21st Century Fox is a spin-off of Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, and we're going to hear a lot about Rupert Murdoch in the next hour or so. And that of course includes Fox News, which is probably, we've all heard of Fox News, right? So that's probably the most well-known. Time Warner and Time Warner Cable have split into 2 companies, so they're 2 of the Big Six, and the last is CBS Viacom. In the UK, 5 billionaires own 80% of the UK media. Again, Rupert Murdoch. Richard Desmond, Viscount Rothermere, and the 2 Barclay brothers, 2 brothers, but they own 1 entity. So really there's 4. And there's a lot of information on there, but I just like this because you can see that that's 80%, but when you look at 100%, we're not faring much better. It's less than 10 people that own the entirety of the UK press media. And actually Lord Rothermere and Rupert Murdoch, if you just look at the top two statistics there, they own over 50% of the printed press just between them, 2 people. So how do politics and media interact with each other? Because I don't think we can look at media on its own. This is a quote from Tony Blair before he was Prime Minister. He was leader of the opposition at the time, and he said, "How we treat Mr. Murdoch's business will depend on how Mr. Murdoch's papers treat us." And of course, for those of you who don't know, Tony Blair is godfather to one of Rupert Murdoch's children. So they're very close, they're like family. And in the recent book last year, Fire and Fury, which discusses Donald Trump's first year of presidency, it talks about how Donald Trump speaks to Rupert Murdoch every single night. at the end of his day. So that's a little bit about how politics and media intertwine. And I think in this one quote, you can see how foreign policy, war, politics, and media owners and specifically intertwine. So this is a quote from veteran Conservative MP, that's a right-wing party in the UK, Glenn Clark, and he says, "Quite how David Cameron got The Sun," and The Sun is the UK's biggest newspaper, "got The Sun out of the hands of Gordon Brown, the head of the Labour Party, I shall never know. Rupert would never let Tony down because Tony had backed the Iraq War. Maybe it was some sort of a deal. David would not tell me what it was. Suddenly, we got the entire Murdoch empire on our side." So we know that the press and the media owners have a very close relationship. So when it comes to coverage of Muslims in the press, how does this connection express itself, this connection between politics and the media? So we're going to do guessing, and this time you're going to shout out the words really quickly. We're going to guess the 8 words most used to describe Muslims in the newspapers. So you can just shout them out. Extremist. Terrorist. Criminal. Fundamentalist. 4 more on this side. Fanatic. That's 5, maybe just a few more to get to 8. Radical. 2 more. It's nothing nice, I can tell you that. Did we say extremist? Yeah. Okay, let's check what they are. These are the 8 words used to describe Muslims the most in the press. Terrorist, extremist, Islamist. Did we say Islamist? Maybe we missed that one out. Suicide bomber, militant, radical, fanatical, fundamentalist, and extremist. So all very lovely adjectives. These are the results from an extensive analysis of press coverage of British Muslims undertaken by 3 academics from Cardiff University's School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies. They analysed the content of almost 1,000 newspapers from 2000 to 2008. And this is what the results were. They found that references to radical Muslims outnumbered references to moderate Muslims by 17 to 1. The majority of the coverage of Muslims in the press tended to focus on a narrow range of issues and recurrent negative types of characterization. And the repetition is really important, because repetition is how you create a narrative, and repetition is how you create a stereotype. And if we look at this is 2000, this is even before September 11th. It's important to remember that. It's 2001, right? This 9/11 was 2001. And so it's a bit lengthy, but these are those key narrow stereotypes that this report found. That there was an emphasis on terrorism, particularly in the context of the war on terror. These stories tended to remove any political motivation from acts of terrorism, focusing entirely on religious factors. There was a representation of Islam as a threat. This kind of news coverage focused on religious and cultural issues in terms of a perceived ideal of British values. And this is really important. The fact that there's been an insistence over 2 decades to say that there is no political reason why somebody who happens to be Muslim might undertake a terror attack. Not foreign policy, not economic policy. This has been the political strategy across North America and Europe, to try and say there's no political reason, it's entirely ideological. There's something inherent in the ideology of these people and their religion that makes them do these acts. So this idea of values is important as well. Again, this is from 2000 to 2008, at a time when they were trying to say there's something inherent in Islam that means it's incompatible with European values, whether it's Danish values or UK values or British values. And if you think about it then, they were laying the groundwork of political policy, because today in the UK, for example, extremism is defined as opposition to British values. So actually we see that the media was talking about issues before they were being put into political policy. The other two were that this idea that Islam is dangerous or backwards was present in 26% of the stories. That's over 1 in 4 stories, compared to only 2% of stories that proposed that British Muslims supported moral values. And there was also a focus on extremism. The other thing the study found was that the images that illustrated these stories tended to fall into negative categories too. So the most likely kind of images of British Muslims in the press were police mugshots or photographs of Muslim men outside police stations or outside law courts. And I've just put one example here. Here's another example using a woman, an obsession which, well, I understand Denmark has already banned the niqab, right? But in the UK, we're still in the phase where the niqab is being demonized and they're trying to ban it, but they haven't. But there's an obsession in the press with imagery of women in niqab. So this is a story that the police have forced this fraudster to take off her niqab and be identified. So now they can identify the horrible Muslim fraudster woman to the world. Muslims were much less likely than non-Muslims to be portrayed in positive settings or in terms of their profession. So they weren't identified as doctors or lawyers or journalists. For example, for myself, I'm a journalist. I've been wearing hijab for 5 years. Before, whenever the national press ever talked about me, they would identify me as a journalist. Since I've put on my hijab, whenever my work has hit the mainstream press, I've only ever been identified as a Muslim woman. So I've never been, my profession has gone out the window since I started wearing the hijab. They're much more likely to be identified, British Muslims, simply as Muslim, as I just said, rather than through any kind of representation that would emphasize other aspects of their identity. So it could be taking away my career and putting in Muslim women, but it can also be done in a negative way, in terms of these are paedophiles, they're criminals who happen to be Muslim, but as you can see in the headline, they're only identified as Muslim. And in a study that started even before that one, so we're going back to 1998 now, Lancaster University analysed 200,000 articles about Islam and Muslims from 1998 to 2009, that's almost a decade. And they found that for every one moderate Muslim mentioned, 21 examples of extremist Muslims are mentioned. And in a later study, we're kind of getting to today now, 2011, this survey looked at 4 newspapers, The Sun, Daily Mail, Independent and The Guardian, and it found that 70% of articles about Muslims were hostile in nature. The interesting thing about this study is that The Sun and the Daily Mail are right-wing newspapers. The Independent and The Guardian are our most left-wing newspapers. They're our left-wing broadsheet newspapers. And just quickly, the United States, terror attacks receive 5 times more media coverage if the perpetrator is Muslim. That's from 2018, so we're up to the present day now. This looked at terrorist attacks in the United States between 2006 and 2015. It found that Muslim extremists received 357% more press coverage. So this is how it kind of broke down. If you were a non-Muslim perpetrator, for example, you happen to be from the Ku Klux Klan, which is this image on your left, you would get 15 headlines. If you were a Muslim perpetrator, you'd get 105 headlines. And the interesting thing is that the disparity is not actually in line with the reality, which is that right-wing and non-Muslim terrorism outnumbers Muslim terrorism in the United States by double. So there's twice as many non-Muslim terrorist attacks in the United States as there is by Muslims. There was a statistic, but I might be getting the years wrong, that over a 4-year period in the United States, 25%, it was either 20 or 25% of all the articles about terrorism were about one single terrorist attack, the Boston Marathon attack, if you remember that. So over 4 years, 1 in 4 articles about terrorism in the United States was about one single attack. So what happens when there's this type of coverage? This is just a splattering of UK headlines. I don't know if they have this in Denmark, but in the UK they're obsessed with halal meat. It's like halal secret of Pizza Express. It's like Britain goes halal. So there's a lot of halal. There's a Ramadama Ding Dong, which is a personal favourite. A lot of things anti-Christian, so the Muslims are plotting to kill the Pope, or they're trying to get rid of Christianity. So what happens when we have this kind of press? Dr. Nargees Moballeghi from Leeds Beckett University says this kind of coverage, this one-dimensional coverage, almost gives people permission to hate. And this permission to hate is translated into hate crime. In a 2010 study that was written actually by a UK former special branch counter-terrorism officer, so somebody who was in the business, so to speak, he did this report with the University of Exeter, and he found that the rise in the number of hate crimes against Muslims is being encouraged by mainstream politicians and sections in the media. And this is the kind of result that you get. Attacks range from death threats and murder to persistent low-level assaults such as spitting and name-calling. We know that across Europe and North America there's been attacks on women with hijab when non-Muslims have tried to grab their hijab. In fact, in the United Kingdom, 2018 saw a record-breaking number of hate crimes against Muslims. That's just a few. This is from North America. So it's a vicious cycle. The media focuses on terrorist attacks on Muslims disproportionately, even in countries like the United States, where, thank you, even in countries like the United States where non-Muslim terrorism is higher. And that fuels hate crime. And what happens, what we know from the statistics, is that if, for the sake of argument, there is 10 attacks on Muslims every week, when there's a terrorist attack, there's a sudden spike, so that'll go up, say, to 35. And it'll go up to an extreme high for a short period of time, usually 4 to 6 weeks. And then it drops down, but it never drops down to the old baseline. It'll come down to 15. And what we've seen over the last 2 decades is that this has become the new normal for us as Muslims. As there's a creep, and slowly the amount, every time there's an attack and the media over-focuses on it, the baseline of attack on Muslims goes back to a higher level. So we get this new baseline of anti-Muslim sentiment, and then there's another terrorist attack, and then the media over-focuses on it, and we just go round and round and round, and that's how we've ended up with this situation where we are seeing more attacks on Muslims on the street than ever before. But another part of that cycle is that non-Muslim perpetrators attacking Muslims get different type of coverage. So there's a disparity in treating perpetrators of violence. A good example of this is this man. I don't know if anyone's seen him before. He's Darren Osborne. He's a terrorist who attacked the Finsbury Park Mosque on the 19th of June 2017. Before we get to the coverage of Darren Osborne's terrorist attack, this is some headlines from 2 terrorist attacks that happened that same month. The Westminster terror attack, both in London, and the London Bridge terror attack that happened just 2 weeks before the Darren Osborne attack. So I just wanted to get your lot's input. Just looking at the way that this story is reported, looking at these headlines, what do you notice about these? See if there's any budding news editors in the room.
It's all negative things about the Muslims.
Yeah, so it's very negative. What about the images? Yeah?
You know, the first 3 are more like subjective about Muslims, and they are underlying terror, but in the meantime, the 3 last ones, they are just objective, so people
Good, so they're focusing on the Muslims. In the top 3, definitely highlighting that, you know, they're monsters, jihadis, there's terror. The things that I notice about these as a journalist is that the imagery is all of the scene. It shows the attacker on the floor in the Daily Mirror one, being apprehended. There's a police officer with a gun to the attacker on one of them. Or you can see Attack on Democracy in the middle there, the Daily Mirror. It's one of the injured. It takes up the whole page, and the headlines are very, very bold, and it's an attack on democracy. Very broad, so this one single attack, this one single person has attacked the entirety of the system. Let's compare it to the headline that Darren Osborne got. What do we think of this headline? How does it compare? Yep.
It's almost making him unguilty.
Exactly, it's almost making him unguilty. Yep.
It's like he's responsible for it for himself, but when it's a Muslim who makes a terror or an attack, then it's all Muslims who are terrorists, not just one person.
Yeah, exactly. So the sister just said, I don't know if you heard, that it's making it just responsible for himself. And that's exactly what's happened here. So first of all, look at, and I'm kind of going through this because I think it's important that even when you're not a journalist, as a Muslim, you should know how they construct news. When you know how they construct news, even when you're looking at news to do with Muslims or non-Muslims, you can see what to look out for. Because you can get editorial from even the product placement in the way that it's been put on the front page. First and foremost, this wasn't just the most important story on that day, right? It doesn't get one story on the front page. All the others were one big story. In fact, that day, the Times thought that Britain's longest heat wave was just as important and should be on the front page. It's talking about the weather. It's taken a whole 1/3 of the front page. And how have they described him? He's a jobless. So they've humanized him straight away. As the sister said here, it's almost giving a reason why he might have been angry or desperate. He didn't have a job. Oh, poor thing, he didn't have a job. He's a lone wolf. He is working on his own. When one Muslim attacks, it's an attack on the entirety of democracy. When a non-Muslim attacks, he's a lone wolf. And I think you can see the subheading on your screens. It says, father of 4 had suffered mental health problems, says family. So automatic, he's a family man, he's a father, he suffered mental health problems. All of these reasons why he might have undertaken this attack. And the image is important too, because the image is very neutral. It's not a picture of the attacker being apprehended by police. He doesn't look menacing. He's even being held by people from behind. And all of these have an effect on us when we're looking at the news coverage. In fact, The Sun at the time called it a revenge attack. This was a tweet that came out at the time. Shocking scenes from last night's suspected revenge terror attack. As if the Muslims in this mosque that were there praying had anything to do with the terrorist attacks that had taken place in the last couple of weeks, and this could be seen as a revenge attack. And this is The Guardian, a left-wing newspaper. There's something I find quite funny about this headline. Usually people don't guess it, but can anyone look at the headline and see what might be amiss about that headline? Any guesses? It says the van drives into a crowd at a mosque, as if the van just drove into the mosque by itself. It didn't have a driver. It was just it was just a van. It wasn't a person that went into. It wasn't a terrorist that went into these people. It was just a van driving on its own. One of these new modern driverless vehicles. And even though this is a left-wing newspaper and it does use the word terror, look at the picture of the imam. This is the imam of the mosque where there'd been a terrorist attack. This terrorist had driven into innocent Muslims. He had killed somebody. The public had apprehended him and were holding him on the ground, and some people had started to kick the terrorist. This imam came and saved the terrorist's life. He took the terrorist from amongst the people that were attacking him and took him to safety. Yet somehow he's ended up looking more angry than the actual terrorist on the front page of the newspaper. And again, this article, it's a bit blurry, but it again talks about the fact that he's homeless, that he was jobless, that he had mental health issues. And just quickly, this was a meme that was going around at the time, which picks apart the issue quite well. So it says, white van driver is a very interesting euphemism for terrorist. And the other thing that's highlighted here, this Mail Online headline says, white van driver injures at least 10 people after ploughing into a crowd outside London's Finsbury Park Mosque, where hate cleric Abu Hamza once preached. And this meme says, this is clear victim blaming. Abu Hamza is long gone, and Finsbury Park Mosque was given an award in 2014 for stamping out extremism. So why would this headline, just a day after Muslims have been attacked by a terrorist focus on the fact that a radical preacher once spoke at this mosque. And then it also picks out that this also says a van ploughed in, so still it's the van without a driver. The Mail Online, just remember that there was no man behind this van. And then he's described as a clean-shaven white man, and he says, when are all clean-shaven white men going to condemn this kind of terrorism? But what's interesting as we wrap up this section is to talk about how Darren Osborne came to attack Finsbury Park Mosque, because that tells us the story of how the media and the politics work together to fuel Islamophobia. Now, Darren Osborne was from a tiny village in Wales. The night before the attack, he was at a pub in Glasgow, in a small area of Glasgow, and he was talking about Muslims are going to march in London tomorrow and they need to be stopped. That's what he was talking about. And do you know what march he was talking about? Does anyone know? He was talking about the Al-Quds Day March. So Darren Osborne actually came to London to attack the Al-Quds Day March. But how did this man from a small village in Wales even know about the Al-Quds Day March in London? Now, that's why I've put this first image of this man on the top right, Majid Nawaz. I don't know if anyone's ever seen him before. I'm sure he'll be very happy for me to introduce him to the crowd here in Denmark today. Majid Nawaz is a former radical Muslim, and he's been de-radicalized by the UK. He went to jail and he came out of jail a reformed man. He has an organisation called the Quilliam Foundation, which gets millions of pounds of government money. And he believes Islam should be reformed. He gets a radio station on London's biggest radio show on London's biggest radio station. He gets touted around the TV to talk on behalf of Muslims. And he writes for the biggest pro-Zionist newspaper in London. And in the run-up to Al-Quds Day, he used his platform on the biggest radio station in London to talk about Al-Quds Day and how all the people that go to Al-Quds Day are terrorist sympathisers and that they're the same as ISIS. And he wrote about it in his column, and all the other pro-Zionist press wrote about it too. And pro-Zionist organisations campaigned for a counter-demonstration against Al-Quds Day. And the far right, Tommy Robinson, who many of you will know, picked that up. They started to ask their far-right supporters to turn up to Al-Quds Day and do a counter-demonstration. And in fact, in court, the judge heard that the catalyst for Osborne's actions included this. His trial heard how he regularly read material from Tommy Robinson and the far-right group, Britain First, amongst others. But it also heard about the bottom right picture, which is a BBC trailer for a show called Three Girls. And the court heard how the catalyst for Osborne's dissent was the BBC drama documentary Three Girls, which focused on the grooming and sexual abuse of young girls in Rochdale by British Pakistani Muslim men. So this wasn't even the news, and that's really important. One is the news and one is entertainment, TV shows, and the representation of Muslims in that. And because of all of this, Darren Osborne decided to go down. He wanted to attack the Al-Quds Day, where there was about 5,000 people marching for freedom for Palestine. He couldn't get there because of a police cordon, so he drove to his nearest mosque and he attacked it. And that shows how each element that misrepresents Muslims can push an environment of hate. And that's the environment we're going to talk about in the next section. So we're going to wrap up section 1. Is there any questions, or should we go for a break and come back for the second section? Yeah?
I don't know if you're going to talk about it afterwards, but could you please tell us, because you're an expert in media and journalism, please tell us what the young people here in Denmark who are not experts in journalism or in media, what they can do to counter the many attacks that we see in the media against Islam. I don't know if you want to talk about it. You want to talk about it?
I want to spend the whole last section talking about it, inshallah. But hopefully everyone will be a bit more lively, because I think one thing is for you guys to say what you think you can do, and we can take it from there. I think there's many things that can be done. I'll try and whiz through the second section, and then we'll get to the third. The third section is just Q&A and discussion, and I think that's one of the key things that we need to discuss. So we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for the second section. Yes, of course you can.
Just a practical one. 4 or 5 people mentioned that control 80% of British media.
Yeah.
Is it those people who set and design the agenda of what we see right now? Or how does it work? I mean, who decides that the front page is like that and all that?
So I think some of that question will be answered in the next section, because we're going to be looking at how politics and politicians in particular influence the media and the agenda. We'll look at Trump and Brexit in particular. If not, ask me that question again at the end of part 2, and we'll get it, and I'll break it down a little bit more. Thank you very much. I did want to show a short video, but by fault of my laptop, I think, more than the technical team, I haven't been able to. But what it was a video by the Islamic Human Rights Commission in the United Kingdom about a survey they did once in 2010 and once in 2015, talking to British Muslims about their daily life and the Islamophobia they face in their daily life and what they see in the media. And it was a piece of academic research. It was called The New Normal for Muslims in the UK. And they've called it the environment of hate. And they gave a definition of the environment of hate that the video described much better, but I'll try to quickly explain, which is that the environment of hate isn't just the media. So it's the media and the language that the media use, but it's also politicians and the language politicians use. It's also laws and policies and the institutions that implement those laws and policies. So schools, the police, the courts. And it's laws like anti-terrorism legislation and policies like, for example, hijab bans. In Denmark, you can't wear a niqab. I was told that you have to shake hands before you can become a citizen. So it's lots of the little things, the small ways and the institutional ways in which an environment of hate is formed. Now, they did research and the findings were in that video, but I suppose what we can do is just to do a bit of unscientific research of our own in this room. One of the questions they asked was, who has seen or heard Islamophobia against another person? So put your hands up, I'll take part as well. If you have seen or heard Islamophobia against another person. Okay, so that's actually, I would say that the brothers, I think, are either deaf. You didn't hear the question? So the question is, who has seen or heard Islamophobia against another person? Okay, so it's about 60% on the sister's side. I think the brothers don't listen so much because there's only a few hands up on this side. So this report actually found that 80% of people had seen or heard Islamophobia against another person. Another question they asked is, who has encountered politicians using Islamophobic rhetoric? So put your hands up if you've seen a politician use Islamophobic rhetoric. Okay, almost everybody, well, just about everybody actually, yeah. This survey found that 84% of people had encountered politicians using Islamophobic rhetoric. Okay, so this is another question. Who has seen negative stereotypes of Muslims in the media? So who's seen it sometimes? Who sees it sometimes? Who sees it all of the time? Who sees it one or the other? Either sometimes. So that's, again, almost everyone. So in this report, they found that 94% of Muslims had seen stereotypes of themselves sometimes in the press, and 40% saw it all the time. And the last one, a more serious one, is about facing physical attack. Has there been anyone who's had to face a physical attack for being Muslim in this room? So the brothers, and that's quite usual, the brothers haven't put their hands up, but you should know that there are about half a dozen sisters who have put their hands up. And actually this survey in Britain found that, and I'm very sorry sisters that you had to go through that. This survey found that 18% of Muslims surveyed had faced a physical attack. That's almost 1 in 5 Muslims. And if the survey is indicative of the number of Muslims in British society, that means 500,000 Muslims have faced a physical attack in the UK. So that's from this environment of hate, that's what the IHRC says. But things are getting worse. In Britain and America and across Europe and the Western world, we know that Islamophobia is at an all-time high. And what we've been talking about is how it's been fostered by mainstream politics and mainstream media as a scapegoat for both domestic policy in our home countries, whether it be Denmark, the UK or elsewhere, but also for foreign policy. Over time, this has fueled domestic far-right fascism that has become increasingly embedded into the mainstream narrative, and that's peaked with what we can see on our screens now. Donald Trump in America, Brexit in Britain, and the rise of the far-right across the European continent. Mainstream politics and media have facilitated the process that has normalised extreme right-wing rhetoric and action. What's important as we move forward and start thinking about what we can do is to recognise that this is actually a strategic and purposeful vicious cycle. What may have previously occurred at a distance behind closed doors is now out in the open for everyone to see. And we can see that because the gap between far-right fascist grassroots organisations and the very top of politics has narrowed. So the distance between the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan in North America, and Donald Trump is so small now that Donald Trump comes out and defends the KKK after they do a terrorist attack in Charlottesville. Mainstream politics and media continue to fuel grassroots fascism, and they're fueled by grassroots fascism. It happens both ways. And a key element of that agenda, which we're going to be talking about in the second half, is a growing network of far-right, anti-Islam online media outlets across North America and Europe that funnel information to each other and push stories out into the mainstream news and political agenda. Most of these we'll know as alt-right. Have people heard of that term, alt-right? So these alt-right outlets, because people don't want to use the word fascist anymore, so they've created a new term for it. They're funded by mainstream political donors and figures. The central hub of this media network is Breitbart News. It's a white supremacist, anti-Islam website that was run by Steve Bannon, who's the man next to Donald Trump here, before Steve Bannon left to run Donald Trump's presidential campaign. He ran Donald Trump's presidential campaign with the money of the same billionaires that fund Breitbart News. So Robert and Rebecca Mercer are a father and daughter billionaires. They're giving Rupert Murdoch a run for his money in North America. They fund Breitbart, and they funded Donald Trump's political campaign. When Donald Trump became president, Steve Bannon left Breitbart so that he can become Donald Trump's chief strategist. That is how close the far right and the very top of politics now are. Breitbart also has political aspirations in Europe. Breitbart London was set up in February 2014 in the run-up to the crucial UK general election with the hope to influence the election result and the subsequent Brexit vote. The same happened in France in the run-up to the election in which Marine Le Pen wanted to try and capitalise on the far right sweeping across Europe, and it's happened in other European countries too. I should have checked if there's a Danish Breitbart office, but I didn't. Maybe someone could Google and find out. What's interesting is how you can connect the dots between Breitbart, a far-right outlet with fascist readers and writers, and the mainstream political right wing of a country. So in America, that's the connection between Steve Bannon and the Republican Party. In the UK, it's between the head of Breitbart UK, or the then editor-in-chief, Raheem Kassam. You can see him there he's on your right, is that correct? On the far right. He's a former Muslim. He's former chief advisor to UKIP's Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage is there on the right of Donald Trump. Nigel Farage is the head of UKIP. That's the party that pushed for Brexit. Raheem Kassam is also a former National Executive Board member of the Conservative Party, the mainstream right-wing party in the UK who's currently in government. Aaron Banks, who's to the left of Donald Trump in the picture as you're looking at it, he's a millionaire. He used to be a donor to the Conservative Party, but then he jumped ship and he started funding UKIP. He also funded Leave EU, which was the main Brexit campaign. Raheem Kassam, so he's got a connection to the Conservative Party, to UKIP. Who else does he have a connection to? The Henry Jackson Society. That's a British foreign policy think tank. And he also has worked at the Gatestone Institute, chaired by John Bolton. John Bolton of Iraq War fame, of course. And John Bolton, of course, is now back in the president's office. He's now special advisor to Donald Trump. So that's the American connection of Raheem Kassam. These are all mainstream organizations with mainstream politicians chairing them. And this photo shows how mainstream their ugly rhetoric has become. It was Raheem Kassam of Breitbart UK, who accompanied Nigel Farage to Washington to be the first British politician to meet President Trump. This was just days after President Trump became president. Who facilitated that meeting? Steve Bannon, the former head of Breitbart. So he was still facilitating. Raheem Kassam was still head of Breitbart in the UK at the time. So his former boss, who was Breitbart USA, who was now a key figure in the presidential office, facilitated this meeting. This is a quote from an extensive report on Breitbart by Hope Not Hate, an advocacy group in the UK. It says, Breitbart is just one part, albeit a vital part, of a wider political project. This operation will be at the heart of a new political venture to create a new far-right party run by multimillionaires. Breitbart is not a news website, it's a political project with a specific political agenda staffed by willing propagandists. And actually now Steve Bannon has given a name to this far-right project. It's Europe. It's a Europe-wide far-right organisation called The Movement. And many far-right organisations, including those in Denmark, have joined it. So, when Steve Bannon was running Breitbart, how do people like him and the media moguls that are funding him use this network to push out anti-Muslim agenda? We're going to look at two examples in the Shia community. And these are examples about sensitive topics, especially left-wing activist topics to do with the LGBTQ community. And it shows how the far right is using the LGBTQ issue when the far right is not a friend of the LGBTQ community, but how they're using these issues to push out stories that hit two agendas. One is a neocon foreign policy agenda, and the other is to stir up anti-Muslim hatred and to divide left-wing support for Muslims and the Islamophobia they face at home. The first example is in North America, and it starts with this little outfit called the United West, which probably nobody has heard of. I hadn't heard of them until I had to do research about this issue over the last year or so. The United West is a local Florida anti-Islam, pro-Israel evangelical outfit. Their mission, you can see some of their mission statement and their objectives up on the screen, is to defend the US Constitution, defend Israel, defeat Islamic Jihad, defeat the left. Their website writes about the global clash of civilizations. The website says, they, meaning Muslims, they are at war, we better be too. They go on to explain that this war against Sharia Islam, whether propagated by the supreme guide of the Brotherhood, or the local imam at the peaceful mosque, or a writer at the New York Times, is above all else an information war, and that they have a passion for confrontational engagement. It's this kind of extreme, radical, patriot language that was boosted by Donald Trump and was in full swing by the end of March 2016 as Trump, boosted by Breitbart coverage and donations from the Mercers, was on the cusp of winning the Republican primary. As part of their information war, outfits like United West monitor local Muslim activity. And that's what these outfits do everywhere in North America and Europe. These small grassroots organizations, sometimes they only have 4 or 5 people in them. They monitor what local Muslim communities or mosques like this mosque are doing. And they do it in 2 ways. Either they research speakers. This is usually speakers who are based indigenously in a center or an area. They find out information on them using internet searches, videos. They spend more hours watching our sheikh's lectures than we do to find anything they can, and then they keep them for an appropriate moment. Or they do it the other way around. They monitor the events pages, and if there's somebody coming to speak, they use the name of that speaker that's been advertised to go and research and find something on him in time to cause a bit of a ruckus before the event. So at the end of March 2016, United West's regional coordinator in Orlando, and Alan Kornman, did one of those 2 things. When he monitored that Sheikh Farouk Sekuleshvar would be speaking at the Husseini Islamic Center of Sanford, he cherry-picked a few sound bites from a really extensive, very mildly worded academic discussion of about 1 hour and 20 minutes that Sheikh Sekuleshvar had given about homosexuality. The video was 3 years earlier, in April 2013, so it wasn't a new video. He'd gone and he'd looked for an old video. What he does is he takes his findings, these cherry-picked sound bites, to the local news station, Channel 9 News Orlando. And here is where journalistic integrity falls apart. And you have to ask the question, who was it you that was asking, where does the agenda come from? You have to ask the question here, because where was journalistic standards in that local community? You're a journalist in that local community. Do you not know that this man is a member of the United West? Do you not know that he is far right? When he brought you just sound bites, did you not ask for the original source? Did you not look at the original video? I don't know if they did or not. Maybe they did and they ignored it, or maybe they didn't bother. But what they did is they ran this news story, and they present Kornman as a concerned resident, worried about the mosque event, and completely ignore his controversial organisation. They don't mention that he's a coordinator of this United West. They just literally introduce him as a resident. He's interviewed and he said, I haven't got the video, but he says, I just can't believe what a simple Google search turned up about the man speaking at this Islamic Center. I'm pretty sure a simple Google search wouldn't have brought up this video from however many years ago. What happened was United West itself took this coverage and it posted it on its YouTube page on April the 6th of that year. Breitbart News picked it up the very same day. And so did several other alt-right outfits in the network that they cover too. And this is a good example of how the alt-right network actually operates. United West is one of many feeder organisations on a local level in a network that Breitbart monitors, coordinates with, or sometimes funds to push stories out. So they have a web of local people, local organisations. Breitbart picks it up. Breitbart has got a huge following. And then when Breitbart pick it up, the rest of the network across the world then pick it up. The local far-right organisations. So it's a cycle, from local to national and back down to local in the far-right sphere, but also from Breitbart to the mainstream. In the same way, mainstream media monitors Breitbart for stories they think can make it into the mainstream cycle. So that's a cycle from the alt-right to the mainstream, and then from the mainstream back into the alt-right, or from national to global and back down to national coverage. And what's quite interesting, I've found, is that mainstream press never picks up the very homophobic, and sometimes violently so homophobic, coverage of these alt-right outlets, including Breitbart itself. But it seems to go for coverage by these homophobic outlets when they're covering Muslim issues to do with LGBTQ. That's again a question that the mainstream media needs to answer. What's interesting, tragically, about this story is that Breitbart News ran that story the same day. It then held the story for 2 months, and it waited for the Orlando terrorist attack, and then it reran the very same story. And it made it out as if these comments made in 2013 that it had covered 2 months before were made on the eve of the Orlando shooting, and that they were somehow related. So they ran the story, and the mainstream press picked it up straight away. Sheikh Sekuleshwar was in Australia at the time, and within 3 days he decided to leave the country after the Prime Minister of Australia ordered a review of his visa. And the immigration minister threatened to revoke it, saying it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for him to return. And what's interesting, I think many people don't think the BBC has the same integrity that it once did. But what's really vital here is that a serious news network like the BBC didn't do basic fact-checking. So they link him to Orlando. He had no link to Orlando at that time. They incorrectly say in the BBC report that the comments he made in 2013 were made on the eve, were made just before the Orlando shooting, as if it had something to do with it. The implication was that the comments in the attack were somehow linked when they were not linked whatsoever. So here was the BBC co-opting a central tactic of Breitbart writers, which is to create headlines that decontextualize information and make false quotes, mislead or inflate claims. The task of the network was complete. A local Islamophobe from a local extremist patriot group in the United States went through local TV news and then Breitbart, who ran the story and then ran it again the next time there was a terrorist attack. Then it was picked up by the global press and ultimately was addressed by the Prime Minister of Australia. Every objective was achieved, pushing extreme Islamophobia into the mainstream narrative, demonizing local Muslim communities, silencing English language speaking lecturers in local Muslim communities, and there was a foreign policy element to this, which was banning any form of pro-Iranian Islamic voices from the Western sphere. Mission accomplished. I'm just going to go through quickly another example. This one starts in Sweden by an irrelevant Iranian-Swedish journalist called Nima Dervish, who's also an ex-Muslim. His social media is mostly filled with anti-Iran and anti-Islam content. He seems to pander both to the Islamophobic left and the Islamophobic right. He has had a long-standing focus on pro-Iranian clerics preaching in Sweden, and he has spearheaded a campaign against Sheikh Hamza Sudaqar since at least early 2013. when Sheikh Sodega happened to be in Sweden speaking. At the time, this is what's really interesting. At the time, he'd done the same thing as the United West. He'd found this old video, he'd taken out these clips, he'd done a blog post about it. And do you know what he said in 2013 on his own blog? He said that he took the story to 6 different newspapers and none of them answered him. None of them were interested. They all said no to the story in 2013. He was so angry about this, he left Sweden. This is how passionate he was about pushing this agenda. He came back, we don't know how, in 2016, where he was making some noise about other issues. He'd been attacking a Muslim chair of an anti-racist organisation because he refused to shake hands with women. He was doing this kind of stuff on the side. But when the Orlando attack happened and Breitbart did this attack on Sheikh Sekalishvar, he picked up the issue again. He did about 3 articles on Sheikh Sekalishvar, and then he went back to that old story about Sheikh Sodega. And look at the difference in climate in just 3 years, between 2013, when we didn't have the rise of Breitbart and the alt-right and nobody was picking up the story. In 2016, there was someone to pick up the story. So it was this time the Swedish alt-right network. They're called, I'm probably saying this wrong, Fria Tida. Not written in English at all, but I picked up the articles. They picked up the article. They picked up that same snippet that he had taken out himself from a video in 2010. And a few other Islamophobic outlets picked it up as well. And so this is a part of that information war. So, but what did Breitbart do this time? They kept the story. And this is Raheem Kassam. Do you remember the man that was in that video with Donald Trump? I mean, this is the narrowing of the space from the bottom to the top. I mean, the man who wrote the article about Sheikh Sekalishvar in Breitbart UK was Raheem Kassam. And they kept that story. There were several months. Now, we don't know what happened. Do you remember those 2 things I said? We don't know which one he did. Did he wait for the sheikh to come to London and then look at his content to find something? Or did he have it from before and wait until we don't know. But what we do know is he ran the story. They ran the story as soon as he got to London, and it made the mainstream press. It wasn't escalated to the level of the Prime Minister making comments, but what we did have were ex-Muslims like Mariam Namazi and people like Peter Tatchell, who's an LGBT rights activist in the UK, really pushing hard on the issue, trying to get his visa revoked. And from what I understand, he's a US citizen, so I don't know if I think he had an automatic visa anyway. The police didn't stop him and he left the country, but it was the same kind of thing. And I think it's important that as Muslim communities, even if we're not journalists, even if we're not activists, even if we're not mosque organizers, that we understand that that is actually what's behind some of these attacks, and that we know how it operates. Because when we know how it operates, we can go and do our research and try and find where does a story come from, where does an attack come from, and provide the adequate support for our clerics or activists or anybody else when they are attacked in this manner, regardless of what we think about what they've said, whether it's right or it's wrong. So I just want to end this section by just going through another diagram of that vicious cycle. And it really is a vicious cycle now. I mean, it's literally low-level groups managing to push out agendas to the top of politics. So it starts with that local far-right group picking up something from the local community, monitoring our local Facebook pages, monitoring our activities in our areas. They make a story, Breitbart picks it up, it pushes it into the mainstream press. Mainstream politics pick it up. Then the mainstream press pick up the political reaction. Breitbart picks it up again from the mainstream press, and then the far-right groups use that to fuel further their hate for Islam. So by the time the Australian Prime Minister had made some sort of comment on this story, Breitbart and that local far-right group had new material to further prove from their perspective why Islam was bad. So that's what I wanted to do in the second session, to kind of show the mechanisms of how the media is currently operating. If there's any questions on that particular topic, I'll take questions now. If not, we'll take a break. What we'll do after the questions is we'll take a break, and when we come back, I'm going to kind of stop talking and we're going to start having a bit of a discussion about how we felt about some of this, if there's what we can do, whether there's Muslims or non-Muslims in the audience. But is there any questions specifically about this? No? Oh, yes.
So you're pointing here, and the strategies that the far-right is using, is it something that we as Muslims can kind of use for our own advantage, like the same strategies, or don't you think that the mainstream media would allow us to do that?
Can we use, well, I mean, infrastructurally, I think you can see that there's a hierarchy and a mechanism here. So organizationally, we should always be organized. We should work. I think what this very neat circle shows is something that's probably lacking in the Muslim community. We are, there's been a strategy to fragment us. And that fragmentation is increasing as time goes on. It happens on the level of sects, so sectarianism. One of the mistakes that I can speak to in the UK at least is that we have legislation called the Prevent legislation, which targets Muslims, and it's Islamophobic. But for many years, it was really only targeting Sunni Muslims. And at that time, Shia organizers, even some of them were saying to local authorities, oh, you know, the problem isn't us, the problem is the Sunnis, so we're cool. And that's a mistake, because as many of us were saying at the time, well, what happens when they come for you? You don't just deal with an issue of injustice when it's happening to you or your mother or your father or somebody in your culture or someone in your mosque. The best way is to have a cycle, to connect with other people, whether they're Muslim, non-Muslim, whether it's the black community facing racism, homeless people. So in that sense, the fragmentation doesn't help. What doesn't exist in this paradigm is any level of fragmentation. Literally, Mr. Allen, in wherever he is, sitting in his bedroom, monitoring the local Facebook page of the mosque, is literally connected to President Donald Trump. I mean, the connection is not that far anymore. But we're often not even connected to people in the mosque next to us. Sometimes we're not even connected to the people in our mosque, or the people that are Muslim and don't attend our mosques. So I think, yes, there's a long-winded answer to say, yes, we should have a collective strategy in the same way that there is a collective strategy on the other side. I mean, of course, I don't think we should use dubious methods as these guys are using. We don't need to lie. We don't need to embellish. You know, we can use facts and statistics and the truth to put our message across. Will the mainstream pick it up? I'll leave that for the second section, because I don't want to influence other people's opinions on whether we think the mainstream can be influenced or not. Is there any other questions on this? Yeah.
Can you comment on why you think that the media specifically are targeting Muslims this area of time?
Yeah.
Okay, my question was, can you comment on why you think that the media is this time of period targeting Muslims specifically?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because it's the most beneficial to them right now. I think one mistake we shouldn't make, which sometimes Muslims make, is to think it's because we have Islam and Islam is the truth and that's why we're being targeted. Actually, minorities are targeted. Black people were targeted, the Irish were targeted in the UK, immigrants are targeted. So there is a method to targeting minorities to get usually out of economic crises, to distract. There's a foreign policy element. I think certainly we live in a very complicated time right now, so it's not just one thing anymore. It isn't anymore just we have to demonize Muslims so we can go to war in Muslim country X. There's a multitude of reasons. Now it's also about growing Muslim communities in the West. I'm sure many of the people that have been born here feel Danish. They might not, someone's going, no, I don't, but that's fine. I, to an extent, feel British. I was born and brought up there. That's different to pandering to this idea that, oh, you have to be British, you have to be British. No, in fact, the argument, the fight is because of that identity, because there's many, many young people who are choosing Muslim identity and it doesn't conflict with anything else that they have in their natural environment, and that's a new challenge domestically. And we're in a very turbulent time for the world, but I think quite newly for us as the privileged few that live in Western countries. We're used to creating chaos in other places and not having chaos at home. And now we live in an era where we have chaos here. We're 10 years, well, more than that, it's 2019. When was the economic crash? 2007? We're 12 to 15 years into a continued economic crash where people lost their jobs, and across Europe, governments used our tax money to bail out banks. And because they did that, then they cut health services and they cut education services. And what did they have to say to the working class communities? They couldn't put the blame where it really is, which is the banks. They had to put the blame on somebody, and they just chose, they chose immigrants. Many immigrants aren't Muslim, which is also interesting, but you see there's no difference in the press coverage. I mean, an immigrant might be a Nigerian Christian, but when they talk about immigrants, they're hitting all the nails with one head, like if you happen to be black, if you happen to be from Africa or Syria, whatever, it doesn't matter, you can be a Christian Syrian, but also Muslims. I don't know if that answers the question. So foreign policy still has a lot to do with it, but I think we all know those arguments. Right? But I think that we live in a world where it's not just foreign policy anymore. And they want to stay rich, which is another reason. Should we take a break if there's no questions, and then we'll come back for more discussion? Oh yeah, go for it.
I'm just asking, how can we change the people's prejudice on the Muslims on the social media?
On social media? Oh, that's a good question. What I'll do is, I'll take that as the first question starting after the break, because it's one of the questions on the board for our discussion when we come back. Okay, thank you. Okay, so inshallah we'll spend the next 20 or 30 minutes having a bit of a discussion, either about some of the things that I've talked about in the previous two sections, but really I want to talk, and please get involved, so I'm not just sitting here staring at you all, about some of the discussion points I thought we can have is, how does this narrative impact us as Muslims? So how we feel about it, how we think it's impacting us in our schools, in our jobs, in our day-to-day life. How should we react to it? What can we do? Should we get involved in the media? And what can we do when they don't represent us? So those are 5 questions I thought we can kind of discuss. And I can take any other questions that people have. But I'm going to start by asking you guys a question, which is, how do you think this narrative that we've been talking about today impacts us as Muslims, but also the societies that we live in and the non-Muslims, part of our society that we interact with? Yep, there's a...
To be honest, I didn't really
seeing how it impacts Christians, we never can imagine this. It's really hard to take it.
So were some of those figures quite surprising to you then?
To be honest, yes. Even though we've seen a lot of things through the years and never, but it's never been that serious. Especially for two last segments about mostly the hate crime against gays and how he was like thrown out of Australia, wasn't it that?
Well, I think technically he left himself under the pressure, and I mean, I've actually never spoken to Sheikh Sekal about this, so I don't want to put words into his mouth, but from what I understand, that perhaps there wasn't the greatest community response around it, but I think people who were more privy to the information would have to.
Actually, they wanted it to be. A lot of people in the community, because of the media, they wanted him to be. They thought it was better that he just left.
Yeah, so I think that from what I understand, it's really difficult to deal with, isn't it? It's just not nice, it's not easy, and so it becomes a question of how do you deal with these circumstances when they come up. I have a very clear position, which is that I think that people who are in an oppressed group, I often make the comparison to the black community in North America. We know the police in America are institutionally racist. They kill black men specifically. They shoot them dead. And what do they do when they shoot a black man dead? You'll see the coverage. Oh, he was a petty thief. Oh, he was a drug dealer. Oh, he didn't put his hands up. He didn't listen to the instruction of the police. So, and you know what? Sometimes, yeah, they can be a drug dealer. So if a black man is a drug dealer, does that excuse institutional racism and the police can come and shoot them dead on the street? No, they can't do that. So we've learned in the black civil rights struggle that focusing on the flaws, the mistakes, or the things that we don't like about a victim of oppression is a tool of the oppressor. So I think it's really important that when we're in those circumstances where people that perhaps we don't agree with what they've said, or we don't like the pressure that it's brought, that it's incumbent on us to still support not the individual or the statement, but to stand on the right side of the argument in terms of what I've explained, to broaden it out beyond your one imam or your one mosque or your one community, and look at the broader political picture that that it's being framed in.
Right now in Denmark we have a problem. They're attacking, it's actually at the moment, they're attacking a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir. You had it in the book as well. If you look at what they attack, it's more political Islam. It's not Hizb ut-Tahrir as being a violent organization, because they never committed any acts of violence. So what's your opinion about not defending the group or their criminals, but the dangerous thing about defending people like that is that you're going to be categorized as the same. They will look at you as the same. If you actually come out, not defend the people, but talk against the whole, what is it called? I don't know what you call it, demonization of this organization.
Sure. So there's two parts to that question. I'll take the last point you said, which is that if we defend certain people, we're going to be viewed as the same. The political strategy of demonizing a minority, and here again, it's really important to look, if you're a Muslim, to look at yourself as a group that is being dealt with just the same as all other groups that have faced racism are being dealt with. So structurally, there's no difference in the way you're being dealt with as Muslims as the black community is being dealt with, or the Irish community, or the immigrant community. There's not, unfortunately, we're actually not that special. It's like we're being dealt with by Europe and North America the way they've dealt with many others. And the point is that they will demonize you anyway. When we distance us in this road of what's happening, The news is getting tighter. So you can delay the inevitable, but I think if you're delaying the inevitable in a way that actually plays into the hands of the inevitable, you haven't got a good strategy. I don't know if that makes sense. You haven't got a good strategy. In other words, I don't want to be pessimistic. Of course, there's ways to be politically active and fight, and we can stop the far right, we can stop fascism, we can stop Islamophobia. We can ally with people who are Muslim and non-Muslim, who are fighting on these issues, and we can make progress. But if we're compromising by giving way to the strategy itself, we might have saved our own backs for a short period of time while it's happening to another person, but it's going to come at our door because we're staying silent while it continues for other people. So that's one thing that we should encourage each other, and I suppose that's the job of journalists like myself or political activists and others, to encourage each other to stand up and do politically active work. How you should deal with Hezbollah Tahrir. Look, Hezbollah Tahrir, I mean, forget about Hezbollah Tahrir. Why did we defend the maltreatment of Guantanamo Bay detainees? I mean, some of these people did horrendous things. At the end of the day, there is a power structure, and people in power, governments, and those with agency don't have the right to choose who they oppress and who they are unjust to. It doesn't matter what you've done. I mean, some people here maybe are a bit younger. I don't know if they've seen the photos of Abu Ghraib prison in the Iraq War. I mean, maybe the people in that photo were terrorists. Does that mean that it's okay to do that? Why did we protest against their maltreatment? So I think it's really important that you stand up for the principle and not the person. That's much more important. And it's then to know what your principles are. And our principles are, of course, they're Islamic principles, but they're Islamic principles. We need to understand the native and indigenous society that we live in. It requires us to be involved in our communities beyond just our mosques and Shia Muslims. If it's a Shia Muslim, not just, you have to reach out to Sunni Muslims, you have to reach out beyond the Muslim sphere to really understand what the problems in society are, so that you can prioritize your principles to your environment around you. So I'm an advocate of unity, but not in a hippy dippy way of just like unity and come together and have a cup of tea. I mean, that's good, but I don't want to dismiss that. But I think really on principles. If you're here in Denmark, I mean, I don't know what the top political issues here are, but whatever they prioritize them 1, 2, 3, and then work with anybody who is going to help you or who agrees with those principles, and you can work towards them. Muslims are divided, and there's a reason for that, because a part of the strategy has been to divide Muslims. And so they want us divided. They want us not to be interacting with non-Muslim society because we're weaker for it. We're weaker than if we're working together. So, did any of us maybe get something from the sisters about how this environment, they think this narrative impacts them? Is someone going to help me out? So I think it's important to hear from the sisters, especially if they're visibly Muslim and they wear the hijab. No? Yeah? Okay, we'll let them have a little think. I suppose the more important question, I mean, I've touched on some of this, but how should we react? How should we be reacting to this environment? Go for it.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Just give me a second.
Take as long as, yeah.
Okay, think the question is a question to your first question.
Okay.
The question is, no. How can we as Muslims rise above the tendency or the proclivity to get influenced by the media's portrait of Muslims? So we see here today, if one of our brothers, he gets a beard, he'll be mocked and called terrorist by his own brothers. So we see that media's portrait of Muslims have really got into our psychology. How can we rise above that?
Yeah. Well, the kind of boring way is to understand everything that was in the first two slides. Because being aware is really, really important. And also because for us, because we're the victims of what is happening, as the brother said at the first comment, he said, I didn't know and I was really shocked. So we have to allow ourselves time for human reaction, right? So it's a process, but it should be a process of being aware of what is actually happening. And then if you want to be angry, if you want to be in shock, go through that process, but do it in a productive way in which you're not just reactionary to a story on a surface level and you're not understanding the infrastructure and the mechanisms behind it. So that's one way, and I mean there's not really an easy solution. I know that sounds a bit pessimistic, but that's the truth. There's no easy way out of oppression. There's no easy way out of injustice. It takes individual responsibility and then collective responsibility and working together to support each other, to have, to create safe spaces. And there's so many different ways. I mean, I find it difficult to give kind of blanket advice because I think a lot of it is to do with who you are, what your expertise is, what you think your responsibility is. My advice would more be don't shy away from your responsibility. If you're a student and you recognize that, you know, my friends are mocking this guy with a long beard, I mean, your responsibility might just be to be the person that breaks that in the side. You know, you're sitting with your friends and you're just saying, you know what, I just don't think you should do that. And that might just be the level of which you think you need to be involved. If you think you can be in media, but you're like, oh, I can't be bothered with the headache. Well, no, push yourself. I think whatever level you're at, push yourself to do a little bit more, to be a little bit more aware, to be a little bit more active. And frankly, we need to encourage political activism. I mean, I can't speak for Denmark, so you guys tell me, but certainly in the UK, Muslim communities aren't doing very well in terms of political activism. You have to be politically active.
We have a phenomenon in Denmark right now at the moment where we see a lot of brown feminists, like Muslim feminists.
Okay.
I won't even say like brown feminists because it's not, it doesn't do with feminism itself. They're pushing forward not even like ex-Muslim or Muslims that are so liberal that they go against the Islamic principles. And a lot of people, they become attracted to these persons because they have a lot of influence and they are portrayed in the media a lot. And some of them, for example, some of the women, they're the ones that they actually put a lot of focus on, brown feminists and these people. What should we do because are they actually, I don't know how to put it, are they damaging the cause or are they making it worse than help, or are they helping the infrastructure that you've been talking about today?
Yeah.
Or no, they are actually, because a lot of people, they see them as progressive, like moderate Muslims that are, ruling prejudice in the society about Muslims. But conservative Muslims would say that these people, they're actually like harming the cause. They are actually helping the infrastructure that you've been talking about.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that. And I'd like to hear from the sisters as well, especially on this issue. And if you have any questions, so I'm going to answer this question, and then somebody on this side of the room is hopefully going to have something to say. That's a really good question, and there's a dual way of answering it. I think in general there's an environment being created where there's an archetypal good Muslim and there's an archetypal bad Muslim. And this is being done in lots of different ways. So we've been talking primarily about the news media today and how politics interacts with it. We talked a little bit about entertainment, so that BBC documentary. But obviously consumerism, fashion, music, all of these things are things in society that influence communities and young people especially. And again, that's not a new phenomenon to utilize those things to influence young people in a minority community. Hip-hop culture was born out of poverty and racism, and I loved hip-hop in the 80s growing up. I remember one person said, one rapper did an interview and said hip-hop was our newspaper. You know, had roots in something, and then it became commercialized. And what did they do with hip-hop? What commodity have they created out of this thing that was born out of a community that was oppressed? And now they commodify it, they've diluted it, they've made it shallow, and they're selling it back to that same community that created it. So we have to be careful when that happens. I also want to be very careful because I don't like attacking individuals who just might have different Muslim women, for example, who have different opinions than me or have decided on different paths than me. But I think they need to be careful. I mean, I've done a critique recently on Dina Tokyo, who's a YouTube vlogger who's recently taken her hijab off. Tomorrow, if inshallah some of the sisters are coming, that we'll be discussing some of those issues. So I think it's about that she has to take these people have to take their responsibility. Are they harming or are they hurting? Well, I'm sure they all start thinking they're helping, right? This concept of like positive imagery of Muslims in the space, and I think to an extent it is helpful, but it's still within a specific infrastructure, so they're still fitting into that infrastructure, and the infrastructure is calling them a good Muslim or a bad Muslim. So a good barometer is to think about how much agency you actually have when you're having that interaction. On the feminism issue, I mean, I assume when you're saying brown feminism, you don't mean like a person who's called brown feminist. Is there like some famous person I don't know about? No, just as in Muslim feminists, you mean?
Unfortunately, there's a whole group of women now that participate in, like, for example, or at least that's what I've seen. Like, they participate. I'm not saying that people can't have difference of opinion. That's not the point. The point is that when they participate in different things, like, for example, gay parade and these things, and they promote LBG, I don't know how many letters there are now, but yeah, something plus. They promote these ideas and values. They make the conservative Muslim look better.
Yeah. So
me as a Muslim, for example, as an imam, if they ask me what's your opinion on homosexual rights, I tell them it's a sin. Then suddenly you're a fundamentalist, you're extremist, right? And you're one of the bad guys now. Why? Because we have moderate Muslims. Look at these guys. They even participate in gay parade, and they're Muslim. So it's you who are doing the wrong thing.
So I think on the feminism issue, let me just be very clear that, look, I mean, the predominant feminist narrative in any of our countries in the West is a white secular feminism. There is much critique by academics and feminists and critical female thinkers that are much better versed to talk about this than me. But white feminism and white secular feminism in particular is one feminism in a broad school of other ideas. The intersectional feminism is having a real surge at the moment. There are amazing women of color who have counter ideas to white feminism. The main thing and my main issue to white feminism are specific types of white feminist argument. For example, when they say, oh, the hijab is oppressive, and they're constantly trying to like liberate Muslim women, is that they're taking away the agency of women. And that is fundamentally, if you are going to call yourself a feminist, an anti-feminist thing to do, to take away the agency of women to have a different type of expression to their womanhood than your particular worldview. Another thing about when we use the word white, where we use white power or we use white supremacy or white privilege, is that white is a power structure. So you could be Asian and follow white feminism. You know, white feminism is an idea, it's a school, it's a theory. So you don't have to be white to follow white feminism, and you don't need to be a person of color to follow, to be an intersectional feminist, or to recognize that white women are taking the voices of women of color. So the argument is like where you're for the sake of argument then to bring in your LGBTQ example, is that then therefore you're a Muslim feminist, you identify as a Muslim feminist and you want to go to a pro-LGBTQ parade. I'm not going to take away your agency to do that. You can do whatever you want. The problem comes to how they're dealing with another person with a different point of view, doing something different. To the point that, at the point in which they are then helping demonize Muslim women who have made a different decision, using the rhetoric, the language, the narrative of institutional Islamophobia, then they have crossed a red line. And this is one of the arguments I've been making with some of the issues we have in the UK at the moment, which is actually we should focus a little less on making a like one way that is the right way. We need to understand that as Muslims, especially living in the West, there are many secular Muslims, there are many non-religious Muslims. We're all facing the same institutional Islamophobia. We should, rather than trying to focus on all of us arguing with each other to get the same point of view, we should agree on what the red lines are. That we will not cross the red line of pandering to Islamophobic narratives in a way that harms another person in the community. Any space, any place that a Muslim or a non-Muslim is doing that, then they've crossed a red line, and that's not a space of allyship. If they don't agree with an anti-LGBTQ, there's not anti-LGBTQ positions, there are Muslims who believe homosexuality is a sin. At the point that you're not coming on a neutral platform to have a discussion about that, and you've moved it to a space where you're using political sensitivities and institutional Islamophobia to bash an already oppressed community because of their particular religious point of view, well, that's problematic. I don't know if that kind of clarifies it. So it's more about knowing where the red line is. Too often we're focusing on the red line of the beard. Like, whose red line is that? If you have a beard and you're an extremist, if you have a beard and that is an indicator that you're an extremist, who says that? Do we say that? Like, most sound-minded people, I'm sure Denmark has hipsters, right? Like, hipsters have really long beards. I mean, in the UK, they have beard oil, and it's like it's a fashion. So, I don't know. Yeah?
She asked how we should react if we see someone encouraging people to non-Muslims or not Muslims like physically violent.
Well, as in on the street, you witness it, or online? I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with the internet. I don't know. I don't know if like getting into Twitter wars with people commenting is useful. But one of the things that, in terms of how should we react and should we get involved in the media, I think that we should, and one of the really good ways is social media. But not as individuals. We should create, organize. We should be creating really good content and we should be disseminating it online, and we should be getting involved in the conversation in that way. Me personally, I'm limited in my optimism as to how much you can change the mainstream. I would have that opinion because I'm someone who I haven't taken a mainstream media route, even when I've been offered it. But that doesn't mean I don't think you should take the opportunity. I think when you have the opportunity to have a platform to say what you want to say, then you should take that opportunity. But if you're speaking and you're speaking and you're speaking and you're seeing that constantly every time, I don't know, you're invited to speak at a news outlet, you're always the one person with your point of view against 6 people they've brought with another point of view, and you're consistently just being bashed and you're not being given a fair voice to express yourself, at some point you need to ask, well, what's the point of what I'm doing? Because I'm just giving them this facade of being, of having a fair debate when it's not a fair debate. So you need to take it like case by case and understand, and again, that's why it's important to understand how the media works. If you understand how the media works, then you're in a better position to make the right decision. A few years ago, I was invited to take part in, do you all know what Big Brother is? The show Big Brother? Yeah. Okay, so they did this thing, I think it was called, it was like a Muslim Big Brother, basically. It was on one of the main TV stations in the UK. And they wanted to put a bunch of Muslims in a house for a couple of weeks. And I was invited to take part, and I said no. And the reason I said no was because I knew exactly, I put myself in the editing room making the decisions of that show. And I knew that they're going to put like one extremist Sunni in there and one Shia, and they're going to see what happens. And by proxy of the fact that I was Shia, I was like, well, I'm going to be invited as the one Shia, aren't I, to be in this room? And I knew that whatever comes out of that, it's not going to be a serious exercise because it's entertainment. And so I didn't do it, and someone else did it, and she didn't tell me that she'd been invited to do it, and if she had, I would have told her not to, but exactly that happened. They created this situation where this quite well-known Muslim man started attacking her and saying she's not Muslim, and this was like one of the highlights of this. And what was also interesting about that show was they had like 12 people in the house, and it was like 10 very liberal expressions of Islam. One Muslim man who took what to most British Muslims would be quite a sound middle ground, and then this kind of more kooky extremist figure. But it was really interesting that they made that Muslim that most of us thought was just like your average Muslim, kind of like an extremist, because he was the only one that was sometimes defending conservative Islam. So you could see how they were like portraying. So in cases like that, I think you need to understand how the media works before you can make a decision. Otherwise, you're going to be like, oh, that's really, really good, and then British society will like us, and it's really. And I don't want to really go against the people that went on the show, because I think they had their own reasons, and I think they were doing the right thing. But it depends which way you look at it, and how important it is to you that people that watch Channel 4 News really like Muslims or not. I don't think it's that important. We should have a bit more confidence in ourselves. Is there another question there? Yeah.
Since you are the one in the limelight right now, I'm just curious about your perspective on the full picture. But firstly, regarding the prayer line, I think this community right here is fully aware of when to stand up, seeing injustice, and to forbid wrong and evil. But regarding your perspective, when I consider this topic, I think this topic deserves a dynamic discussion. I cannot stop thinking about it from the backwards.
From the?
From backwards.
Okay.
From the previous times, because these articles you are bringing up as examples here are concerning Muslims in the West, mostly. And how did they end up in the West, firstly? And isn't it the same powers that are controlling these Britain destinies as the history books, because of colonization and imperialism and all these things, and some people might consider my realism as a pessimism, because I'm thinking about the end of the times right now when I see this all these powers that are the dominant powers having the target on Muslims specifically, or on religion. We can see or say that the religion has become the world enemy number one because of a narrative dominated by powers. And I just want to hear your perspective since you are the one of the limelight.
Well, we're still living the legacy of colonialism. I am someone who subscribes to kind of a decolonial thinking. So there's our education systems, the infrastructures in which we live in, they're the continuation of colonialism. Colonialism imparted something which was white European Christianity to the world. But there is one, I should say, as I'm a sister giving this talk, there is one oppression that happened at the time when colonial empire was expanding. We had, of course, the burning of books in Muslim Spain. Then we had going to the Americas and killing the indigenous populations from Spain. They burnt the books in Spain, they burnt the Muslims and Jews in Spain. Then Columbus went on a ship from Spain to the Americas, killed all the indigenous people, established the Americas, and then they went and they did the slave trade, and they killed black people, enslaved them, and brought them to America to build the nation. But there is something else that they were doing at that time, which was they were killing white European women as witches. And this was white European women who were intellectuals. So patriarchy actually is a thing in colonialism. It was also anti-woman, even when those women were white. And it destroyed knowledge structures. So we're living now in the fall of that time. That's what my belief. That's what my belief is. That's what my political position is, because that was an empire that was created and a worldview that was created, and from there we've had recent manifestations of it in terms of capitalism and whatever. So that definitely exists. I mean, are we in the? I'm not going to get into a kooky conspiracy end of times conversation. I think one thing that's important in what you're saying is that one aspect of colonialism on our minds and our psyches is that we think that colonial powers or the powers that be have absolute control over everything, and we're living in a time that proves that's not the case. I don't think that's not the world that we're living in anymore. We have social media. We have the instability we see can be taken in two ways. The negative part of it, a lot of which we've talked about, but also the possibilities that come out of it. The possibilities out of instability. Yeah, I think colonialism does have a part to play in today.
Do you think it's still embedded in the structures nowadays?
Yes, I do. I do believe that. And that's when you look at it in that lens. Again, that's why it's important. This isn't like a Islam. I mean, I don't want to. We have to look at it from a political paradigm. That it's looking at it and being like, Islam is the truth, therefore they're attacking Islam. That's not the only lens to look at this in. I mean, it's very consistent. I mean, what is being done to Muslims is very consistent to what these powers have done to many, many people. The indigenous populations in America, the Africans. It's not very unique. It's quite in line with how they behave and how they've built their structures and how they operate, especially since World War II till now in the modern era that we have. I think is that about the time? Is there any more questions?
Sorry.
Yes? Oh, great.
You can answer what can we do and they don't represent us.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are supposed to answer all these questions and you've just had to be bored listening to me speaking. What do you think? I'm going to put you on the spot. What can we do when they don't represent us?
Like there are certain areas in China that they don't represent us in which we are overrepresented most of the time. I'm not sure what we can do because like kind of the voiceless in that to have to regain their voice or not.
So I think I'll just go to these were my kind of discussion, my conclusions for the discussion. I don't know how relevant they all are now. What to do when they don't represent us? I think I wanted to end on a positive note, and I hope it's quite positive, but at the same time, I think we need to be realistic about where we are at. And the reality is we're very fragmented. So I think the very first thing we can do when they don't represent us is to start building again. I mean, we're still in this moment when we need to build. So to build is to remember that Muslims have the right to individuality, and we need to respect our plurality. This is increasingly difficult the more quote unquote conservative you are, because the more conservative a space you're holding, usually you're being demonized by other elements of your own community as well, and you're having to deal with that. You're having to deal with that too. But I think it's really important that you start thinking indigenously. So that's what to do when they're not represented. Think indigenously. Think about the, yes.
Sorry, I just had a comment to that. You said that we should respect plurality. You mentioned the word. But at the same time, you said they're working for fragmenting the Islamic community. That itself, isn't that a part of like just accepting that there's a lot of fragments, and that things go into fragments?
How do you mean?
Respect,
No, I'm saying that we should. The divisions is because of our differences of opinion, because we're not accepting the fact that we can have differences of opinion and still be together. So fragmentation is happening is because they're making the discussion so microcosmic that we can't be together if we have a difference of opinion on whether we should pray if it's Sunni Shia, how we should pray, or foreign policy. Within Shias now we have so much.
The building next door, they got like 4 or 5% years themselves. It's among Shias itself.
So I mean, I'm acutely aware of, so I'm saying if that's how bad it is, you need to work backwards, right? You need to work backwards. If we've become all of these little islands. So actually, I think that what is often happening is, like on LGBTQ, which is the division on both of the examples I spoke at. I mean, that's not actually really the division on the table that's fragmented the community. There's other things that have fragmented the community. But why are we not getting together? What's happening is whatever those things are, whatever those priorities are, you've put them on top of the indigenous priorities of the community. But we don't have, let me put it, I don't think we have that much. I think the majority of Muslims agree on the key things that are facing the community. They're being sidetracked on these other arguments. So when I'm saying we should respect our pluralities, is to say, look, we don't have to agree on everything before we get round a table to deal with issue A. In the UK, I can give an example, for example, Prevent. Or at the moment, they're doing a campaign on RSE. which, yeah, I'm not going to put my personal opinion on that of, I have my own opinion on it, but I'm saying it doesn't really, in a way, that proves my point. It doesn't actually really matter. I should respect the plurality that some people are doing that campaign and it's relatively successful. And now they have Christian communities and Jewish communities together working on this issue to deal with sex education in the schools in the UK. So we need to, when I say plurality, we should be working to the point where as much as whatever divisions are around us, we're healing them. That doesn't mean we have to, the division needs to be healed. It doesn't mean we all have to have the same opinion at the end of that conversation. It's that we can say, okay, how are we going to deal with this? And that's why the third point is that we should have a multi-pronged approach. And we have to stop saying that, oh, there's just no point of putting anything on the internet. And why do you do this? And why do you even have why do you even go to the mosque? Why do we even need Muharram Majalis? And don't do Muharram Majalis, do this instead. Well, why can't we do all of it? The Black Panthers are a really great example. For those of you who haven't looked into the Black Panthers, read into like how well they did in this plurality, like in having a multi-pronged approach. Like do all of it. If Brother A is good at talking in the mainstream media, then plug him into the mainstream media, but also have grassroots protests and do that. It doesn't have to be one or the other. What we're doing now is like some people protest and then everyone's arguing, oh, why are you protesting? And then no, we shouldn't protest, and then we shouldn't have this flag, and then we shouldn't do this. Everyone's arguing over the minor details rather than thinking we can do all of the strategies at the same time, as long as our principal political aim, this is the thing, it's a principal political aim. I can't speak to what's good for Denmark, for Danish Muslims. You know what's good for you. The young people know. Listen to the young people. Get them together, ask them, and then do loads of different approaches. Inshallah. So I just want to... and then just the final thing is the red line to plurality. There's a red line to plurality, which is that you should never use any form of institution, language, or narrative that plays into institutional Islamophobia. And I think the rest I said. So understand what's happening, use your expertise. Whatever your expertise is, use that to do it. It doesn't have to be journalism. Be active and proactive. Although I will just end with having said all this negative stuff about the media, I have been a journalist for 12 years. And I do think we need more Muslim representation in the press.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Doctors and lawyers and stuff. I'm not saying it's bad. Bad, but unfortunately we have our what is it called, priorities in our society, especially amongst the Shias, is completely like out of hand. If you look at the situation of the Muslims and Islam in Denmark, I'm not trying to demonize anyone, don't misunderstand me, but I'm really glad that if you can emphasize on that.
Yeah, so we have a lack of representation in journalism, Muslim journalists. Be proactive, you can do it on social media, get together in groups, make content, put it out, go into the media, make your own decision. I'm someone who's decided not to work in the mainstream press. I've liked my journey in the alternative media and the spaces I've occupied. The compromises that were put on my door were not ones I wanted to make, but I understand when other people make it, so be true to yourself. And make the decisions that are right for you, but really have a voice and try and influence, try and create your own spaces to influence. We don't need to do it. I mean, I really do think the mainstream media is basically over. I mean, we all use online. So yeah, that's my final encouragement. Despite having said all of this negative stuff about the press, you can really make a difference. In the 2 years that I've been doing freelance journalism and just been posting stuff, not very often, but sometimes on my social media, content does go viral. Content does make its way into the mainstream, and that is a good way to do it too. I think we've gone over time. If there's no more questions, we'll end it there. The sisters were very quiet, but hopefully tomorrow we'll have more. Thank you very much.